Our panel this morning will talk about the urban housing crisis. And from the program description, you probably read that by 2025, 440 million urban households, or 1.6 billion people worldwide, will face inadequate, crowded, and substandard housing. The UN estimates that between $9 and $11 trillion of additional new investment in housing will be required to close the housing gap. This presents an unprecedented challenge and opportunity for civic leaders, developers, builders, and to the rise of the global construction demand. A recent Forbes article by Lawrence Young calculates the current shortage in the U.S. alone to be upwards of 8.3 million housing units. And certainly California is a large part of the equation. Developers here are building an average of 80,000 homes per year when we really need 180,000 per year. I'm your moderator this morning. I'm Gail Goldberg. I am the executive director of the Urban Land Institute here in Los Angeles and the former planning director for the cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. To my far left is William Witte, who is chairman and CEO of Related California. Hessam Nadji, who is the president and CEO of Marcus and Millichap. Laura Archuleta, who is president of Jamboree Housing, and Christopher Hawthorne, architect critic for the Los Angeles Times. We have an all-star cast. I'm going to go ahead and start with the state of California. So, Bill, what's so different about California in the housing market?
Well, I could take up the whole hour.
Don't.
On that subject. Let me give you one statistic which I think summarizes the way it's most different. Seattle, which is not Kansas, Seattle's a environmentally sensitive West Coast city, in the last 7 years has built 1 new housing unit for every 3 new jobs. San Francisco, which is, at least in recent years, very aggressive in promoting housing, has built 1 new housing unit for every 12 new jobs. Now, why is that? In Seattle, apparently, other things being equal, it takes 8 months to get a land use approval. We are about to, hopefully next week, get approved in San Francisco for a city-backed site. It's a 540-unit apartment tower, and then we're fee building a new office building for the city that they will own, and planning and building will go into. It's got all the city backing. That's taken almost 3 years. That's the best you can do. You can't do any better than that. So therein is the fundamental problem, land use. It's not that California should be environmentally insensitive. It's not that there shouldn't be an Environmental Quality Act, but it completely adds to the time, the cost, and frankly, the inability to produce housing at a significant clip. That is not a debatable proposition. That is a fact. The other thing I would say is that California, more than most states, I think, vests just a huge number of tiny jurisdictions with land use powers. So there's very little regional planning. There's LA County is a perfect example. I don't know how many jurisdictions there are. They each have planning commissions except for unincorporated areas. So now, that is not to say that you can run roughshod over communities, but land use right out of the chute is there is no other state that approximates California's land use process. Our parent company is the biggest developer in New York City. New York isn't exactly easy. It's a day at the beach compared to California.
Mm-hmm. So Hessam, what do the folks you talk to, your developer and entrepreneur friends, think about California? The same challenges we're hearing from Bill?
Exactly, and it's a good problem to have in the sense that California is a dominant region for job creation. The technology orientation, the trade jobs, the entertainment jobs, the tourism related jobs are all generating more and more demand, which is a good problem to have. The other side of the housing shortage side of it, Bill articulated extremely well on the development side. But what we're hearing more and more from our more entrepreneurial, not just developer clients, but investors, is the push for redevelopment and renovations, because there is no way that new construction alone is going to keep up, even come close to keeping up with the kind of demand we're seeing. Therefore, there has to be as much attention put on how to make the redevelopment and renovations more practical, cheaper, and more attractive for developers that are willing to take the risk of buying an asset, property, improving it, and being able to basically cater to a bigger audience than is being done today.
So at what point do we stop producing the jobs if we don't have housing that can adequately house the employees that we're trying to attract?
I think we're already starting to see that in a number of pockets. I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, their employment has been on fire over the past 4 or 5 years. In the last 12 months, it's been less than half. They only added about 17,000 jobs in the last 12 months. Part of it is housing limitation and inability to attract new workers to their region because of affordability and because of congestion. Traffic is another, a whole other, we could spend another hour talking about just congestion, but that's another factor.
So our market rate developers are having a really hard time with both the process and the regulations. Laura, you're trying to provide a supply of housing for folks who can't afford their housing. How's it going?
Well, I think we have the same challenges that the market rate developers have, plus a whole layering of additional challenges. And starting with the reduction of funding sources that help subsidize affordable housing over the last 5-7 years have continued to be reduced. It's really depressing if you're an affordable housing developer, if you work for a local agency and you're trying to get housing built for your constituents. It's very, very tough. And I think it's exciting where we develop in Southern California and up in the Sacramento region here in California that jobs are coming, but I would just challenge that the jobs that are coming those employees cannot buy housing or even most of the time rent housing. So we're seeing a huge influx of lower paying jobs, and that's just furthering the overcrowding and the undersupply and the thousands of people who come on our wait lists at our properties. We right now have 18,000 Californians living in our properties, and we probably have another 100,000 folks on the waiting lists. And we're just a kind of small, medium-sized affordable housing developer. So just imagine as you look across all of the developments out there. So I think it's always been challenging, but I think it's even more challenging now. And, I'm looking for solutions all the time.
What are the additional constraints that affordable housing has?
Well, I think that it's interesting.
Is it all the financing?
Well, the financing's the first one because the financing's competitive, and that competition, how you score, changes every year. So you may have a project that you're working on, and a couple years later, or a year later, or 10 years later, when you get your entitlements, the funding sources completely change. So we'll hire project managers in from the market rate side, and they're shocked, right? Because on the market rate side, if you've got the right rate of return and your investors lined up, you're ready to go. So they're shocked at how this competition works for the low-income housing tax credit, which is the largest subsidy for affordable housing in the country. And so it's very eye-opening to them. But the community process is something that at Jamboree and in my past life working in city government that we've taken really seriously, and I know you have, Gail. Going out to the community, hearing what they want, having their input, but doing it in a very intentional way where you're focused on this is the need, we're going to be building affordable housing. What do you want to see and what are your concerns? Not going out and saying, do you want affordable housing? Because you're not ever going to win that one for the most part, right? In existing neighborhoods. But so really doing it focused, talking about design, talking about architecture, talking about the needs. I think market rate developers do that, but when you're in the affordable arena and you're looking for 5 to 7 layers of financing and you need all those different discretionary approvals, it gets even more difficult.
Chris, We have been very lucky here in Los Angeles since you arrived, because you have taken sort of a broad look at going beyond architecture and really delving into planning and urban design. The rest of us are sort of caught in the weeds, I think, here of development. So looking at the larger picture, what do you see that maybe we don't?
Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. Really nice to be here. I've been fortunate that my editors at the Times have really supported me in defining my job quite broadly. And even I began at the Times in 2004, and I was interested really right when I got here, but this has only accelerated since I've been in the job, in looking at the city itself and really taking Los Angeles itself and its evolution as my chief subject. It's my feeling that there's no city in the country that's going through such a significant change in terms of its civic identity, hashing out some really basic, almost existential questions about what kind of place it wants to be. And housing is right at the center of that. So the kind of shorthand framework that I've been using in the series of public events that I do with Occidental College, where I teach, is talking about this emerging city as the third Los Angeles. And basically that means the first LA is the streetcar pre-war city that really was connected by transit, that really did have lots of innovations in multifamily housing. And the second LA is that post-war LA that was organized around the car and the single-family house and the subdivision that produced all of those cliches and tropes that the whole world is familiar with when they think about Los Angeles. And that now we're moving in really into an entirely new phase of the city's civic life that I'm calling the third Los Angeles, which is a city that's really trying to redefine itself, trying to invest quite heavily in transit, trying to think beyond the single-family house. So for me, it's not just a broad, holistic view, it's also a longer historical view. And I think it's particularly useful in terms of housing and mobility, because unlike cities that really were born with the car and the freeway, Los Angeles has in its civic DNA experience with transit. We have the most our streetcar network was the most extensive transit network in the country, if not the world, in the early decades of the 20th century. We had those experiments in really forward-looking multifamily housing by architects like Irving Gill and R.M. Schindler and Richard Neutra. So in the DNA of the city is a city before the car, before the freeway, that really produced a lot of the things that we're struggling to add now: multifamily housing, walkability, pedestrian culture, mass transit, places to to think about a different kind of housing setup and paradigm that's not just about the house and the garden. So I think a lot of the problem, to go back to what Bill and Hessam said about the struggles in producing, I mean, I think we can all agree that we have not produced nearly the supply of housing that we've needed to. I think the state study that we probably are all familiar with suggested over the last 30 years we're probably underbuilt by, 1 million units? And a lot of that is tied to a kind of a basic disagreement or tension about what kind of place we want to be, whether we want to maintain our identity as a city that's organized around the car and the single-family house, or whether we want to think about a new identity that connects to what Hessam was saying, that really focuses on folding back and developing in infill parts of the city that we developed pretty lightly before. So the last thing I'll say is that I think part of that is recognizing that we're not growing as fast as we did. If there's one thing that connects the first and second LAs, it's really headlong growth, and growth that's happening so quickly that the city and region didn't have a chance to really think about consolidating its gains or really planning for the future. And now we're growing much more slowly. It's really a post-growth city in many ways. It's a post-immigrant city. Immigration to LA County peaked in 1990, so more than a generation ago. So I think the one silver lining I would say is that we have a chance to really have a conversation when we're growing slightly more slowly. Think about consolidating those gains of the last full century or more. And have that conversation that we're beginning to have. It's a difficult conversation about what kind of place we want to be in. I don't think we're going to solve this housing problem and the issues connected to CEQA or parking reform, all those things that we all talk about, before we have a better and clearer picture of what kind of city we really want to be moving forward.
Well, I hear a little bit of optimism there. So both of you have chosen to be in California. Bill, you work primarily, in this state. What keeps you here? Do you have optimism for the future that we can solve some of these problems?
Well, California, and especially LA, I might add, is and always has been a dynamic place. So if you're involved in the realm that we're involved in, it's never boring. It is very dynamic. And I think we've gotten to the point that Christopher just mentioned is, okay, what do you want to do with that dynamism? And that's certainly huge. I started my career in Philadelphia. Philadelphia had 25,000 abandoned housing units. It's hard to be optimistic when you're confronted. You know, I was working in an urban homesteading program. It's hard to be optimistic in that kind of situation. Here, there is potential, and there are some bright spots. There's been a lot of look at statewide solutions, which I think are politically challenging. But in the last election, 3 or 4 counties that required a 2/3 vote passed, not comfortably, but they got more than 67% of the vote for affordable housing bonds. Alameda County, which includes Oakland, 570 million, I think. Santa Clara County, with heart of Silicon Valley, 900 million. LA City, $1.2 billion primarily for homeless, and more recently LA County, a Measure M, I think it was, for the operating side of homeless. So that means over 2/3 of the population, at least at some level, acknowledged that in its jurisdictions something has to happen. So we're left with execution challenges. But you know, there are positive things happening. There's still a lot of work, you know, that needs to be done. I do think, though, that people have to get out of their silos. Every time an initiative is proposed, you hear from the labor unions, you hear from the environmental community, you hear from this constituency, from that constituency. Everybody says they want the same thing, but they don't act that way. And until that changes, you're still going to have, I mean, when was the last time, now I'm going to get candid here, when was the last time the Sierra Club, just because it's affordable housing and infill, supported an affordable housing project? I can't name you one incident, not one, not one. When was the last time groups went out of their box and said, we need to deal with housing? I can't think of many of those. So the flip side is you can't ignore neighborhood groups. We can all say, oh, they're NIMBY, they're this, they're that, and I think Laura and Chris both alluded to this. LA is a perfect example. It didn't pass Measure S, which was badly written and huge overreach, but there was...
Can you describe Measure S for folks?
So Measure S would have, I think, it basically would have imposed a 2-year moratorium on any project in LA, possibly over a certain size, but that would require a zoning variance, a general plan amendment, or a whole realm of discretionary approvals. And since LA has done so little, passed so little comprehensive planning, a huge number of projects from homeless to high-rise would have been affected. And people actually thought it might pass. You know, there was a huge, even the governor weighed in. It lost badly, but people should not take that with any degree of comfort, because a lot of what was alleged is true. So I think you have to include, as Seattle does. Seattle is more neighborhood oriented and less institution and EIR, environmental impact report centered, and a lot more gets done.
To what extent do you think, Hessam, that the problems that need to be solved first are on the ground with the community members, the neighborhoods who are impacted by development that they didn't know was going to happen? They didn't have a plan that showed it. So to what extent do you think our problem really starts with a community dialogue?
Before I answer that very hard question, let me go back to your bright spot question, because just so we can have a little fun talking about maybe a few good things that are happening. And to your point about the origins of our companies and why California. So our company was founded in the Bay Area in 1971 on a very simple premise, and that is the private individual real estate investor didn't have an organized way of looking at investment opportunities. Our whole system, our whole company was developed to create that in California and went national with 80 offices and so on. The importance of that is that we deal every day with entrepreneurial real estate investors and developers, large and small, that are looking to create value. And as it's become harder and harder to do so, and it's become more expensive to do so, the bright spot that I want to mention in this process is the opportunity for value add. The opportunity, even in California today, you can still have numerous types of investors, from the most sophisticated institutions to the smallest private investor, find opportunities to acquire an asset, do some upgrading, renovating, and repositioning to it, make it much more feasible from a housing perspective, create value for themselves, and create a better living environment for the audience. That is still a huge opportunity, and we're helping people do it every day. But to the second part of your question, it is a local problem. I mean, and Bill is the best spokesman for this. Related is a phenomenal client of ours and a phenomenal developer across the country. If we can make at the local level the process that Bill's talking about just a little bit faster, a little bit easier, and to have some understanding of the fact that the developers are challenged with their own investment returns and their own hurdles, if you will, in an entrepreneurial capitalism-based environment, they have to have profits. They have to have turnaround times that make sense in order to create that housing solution for the population. And so it has been viewed as the developer is sort of out there and everyone else is over here. It's this us and them that needs to your point, I think, that needs to be addressed and approached more holistically, as we need the developers to be successful at this and profitable at this. And they've sort of been viewed as the us and them part of the equation.
It's interesting because I think that was really evident in the campaign locally around Measure S, because the pro-Measure S folks sort of portrayed everyone on the other side as wealthy, corrupt developers. And
that's actually redundant.
Yeah, okay. And the opposition to Measure S, I think, painted everyone on the other side as NIMBY no-growthers. And one of the interesting things that I think may have come out of that discussion, besides the very Trumpian campaign, was that they had much in common. The problems that the developers and the neighborhoods had with lack of predictability, which is a big problem for everybody, just not knowing what the city wants and not having had that discussion in a community is difficult. In Los Angeles, it feels a little like figuring out how we're going to grow is maybe a step ahead of the real discussion, because many folks in Los Angeles, and I suspect in other California cities, are going, do we have to? Yeah. I don't want to grow. It's crowded already. How do we deal with that? And you talked, Laura, about having real dialogue with communities. At what point do we sit down and have the basic conversation about growth?
Well, I think it's all part of it. I think you have it now, and I've been at Jamboree for just under 20 years now. And when I came in Southern California, we had a ton of funding to fund affordable housing, but I couldn't get any political will. I mean, that was a struggle. I think our first project down in San Clemente was the first 100% affordable development built in 10 years in Orange County, so for large families. So that has changed. So we, on the bright spot, it has changed, and I think it's changed very much organically, very much from neighborhoods saying, we've got homeless people sleeping in our park, and then talking to us when they're opposing our project and us saying, well, we can actually house those people. We're not going to bring people in from outside. Oh, we're not going to bring them from LA, right? But we'll bring them right there from the park, and they'll be able to live here, and then getting support. So I think that the solutions, whether it's CEQA reform by right, density, reuse of sites, creating value, all of those solutions come from a change in mindset, and that mindset has to come from working with and listening to the residents that are there, but along with some, again, a kind of intentional ideas of what could be, and getting their input.
If change is best motivated by fear, which I think the homeless
Right.
situation created, or inspiration, and we haven't decided if we're going to grow or not, or we haven't settled that, how do we get to a place, Chris, where we can really talk about comprehensively what is our vision for our state and for our city? A common vision that we have.
That's probably the most optimistic thing anyone said so far this morning. I think Bill's right that we do have to, despite the results in Measure S, in the Measure S vote, we do have to talk about reform. We need to keep that conversation going. We need to ask why comprehensive planning reform hasn't happened in this city. At the same time, my sense is that the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of local neighborhood control when it comes to land use, when it comes to housing, when it comes to decisions about how to remake the city. And there has been so much wealth created, so much equity built up in the generation of homeowners who bought their houses, were lucky enough to buy their houses in the 60s, 70s, and 80s all across California. And my parents in Northern California are among that generation, the house I grew up in, which they bought for a song in 1972. And I was in a house the other day in Los Angeles that the owners bought almost 60 years ago for $20,000. It's probably worth $3 million. So we're not just talking about houses that have gone up a little bit. We're talking about houses that might have gone up 50, 75, even 100 times. And that has created, that has warped the political conversation in my view, because there is so much for those homeowners as a group, as a generation to defend. They're so active in the political conversation, both in terms of engagement and in voting, in contributions to elected officials and campaigns, that the decisions have become too local in my view, and that we need to rebalance to have a broader vision about where the city's going. But that's difficult. And I think the degree to which it's warped can be suggested by one of the narratives that emerged during the Measure S campaign, which is that development is out of control. And that's a narrative that a lot of people bought into. So much construction is happening that the basic character of the city and neighborhoods is being irretrievably changed and lost. The fact is that we're building more than we did a decade ago, but we're still not building enough housing, as a couple of people have already mentioned, to make up for how slowly we built housing over the last 30 years. And also, I think in some ways the electorate is ahead of City Hall now in terms of some of these reforms. And I think the results of Measure S suggest that. Not just the fact that this planning reform measure shopped for a particularly favorable electorate in March. They went after an older, whiter homeowning electorate, and they still failed to get 30% of the vote. That sends a pretty strong message. I think also the fact that everyone in City Hall that I talked to, including several council members, thought it was going to be a nail-biter. They really thought that there was so much concern about the level of development that Measure S, if it didn't pass, was going to get very close. The predictions I heard from everyone at City Hall was it's either going to win or it's going to come very close. And it didn't just lose, it got trounced. So with that very favorable electorate in a very small turnout election. So I think when you combine that with the more than 71% vote for the last transit measure last fall, I think there is a very strong message from the voters that they're interested in moving forward with some of this reform and producing housing at a different rate. And I think now the ball is really in City Hall's court to begin to listen to what those voters are saying, in my view.
Think there's any chance that's going to happen, Bill?
That City Hall will listen?
Yes. Candid. There's
yes.
no one out there.
Yes. You have in LA, despite what I could say a reluctance to take leadership positions on this issue, across the city council and certainly the mayor, people are pretty knowledgeable and very pro-housing. Maybe this will send the right signal as not whether we should do it, but how to go about doing it. So I certainly think it's possible, and they should be emboldened not only by Measure S, but by the homeless vote. I'm not sure 10, 15 years ago those get 2/3 of the vote. They should be emboldened by that. LA is a challenge because it's so big and sprawling. It goes from San Pedro to Sylmar. I mean, it's tough. It's tough, and anything that attempts to do a citywide thing in LA is hard because there's so many disparate places. You know, San Francisco is 48 square miles. That's like one councilmanic district in LA, you know, distance-wise. So, but I do think the message is coalescing, and I think you have the right messengers in City Hall. What may be lacking is if housing is really an issue, and I was talking to Chris about this earlier, I'm not sure there is a spokesperson at the department level in LA. There is in San Francisco, there is in some places. There isn't. Who do you go to? Let's say you want to talk housing policy. You want to articulate a position to Sacramento. Who, other than an elected official, certainly the mayor can do that well, but he's the mayor. He's got a lot of things to worry about. Who can do that? I'm not sure who that is.
I think that's a great point, and really it was eye-opening for me in trying to figure out how this all worked politically when I first arrived to realize and begin to understand how much power is located in each planning deputy in each council member's office. And really that's where all the deals get made, a kind of horse trading between council districts rather than at the citywide level. And that happens to a degree in every big city in the country, but I don't know that so much power is located in the planning deputies' hands as is the case in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, it is peculiar to Los Angeles that we have 16 planning directors, and only one of them actually has the title.
Right.
Yeah. Bill, you talked about the issue, and I think this is true when we look at large-scale policies, either for the state or for the city of Los Angeles, that it's hard to come up with a policy that really increases the production of housing for the entire city, because a policy that works well in one community will be problematic in another community. What are the solutions to that? One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I think I've mentioned to you, is that how do we in the city of LA, the creative capital of the world, why can't we be the urban laboratory of the country? Why can't we try new things here, maybe at a smaller scale, and let things sort of grow organically? People in LA need to see it. What about modular housing? What about ordinances that relax the rules for granny flats? All of this in a specific area where they want it. Would that work in LA?
Yes, and there are examples. The Adoptive Reuse Ordinance, which was implemented, 20 years ago, mostly for the historic core in downtown LA, you know, has borne tremendous fruit. A lot of stuff happened that couldn't under the old code, the obsolete code, have happened. That's a good example. It wasn't necessarily relevant citywide, but it helped kickstart the huge, what has become the huge growth engine in LA right now in downtown. You know, modular, we're looking at very seriously now. There's some examples in the Bay Area. I'm not sure about in Southern California. Why should you even look at it? In San Francisco now, because we have a funny business. We do affordable housing and high-end housing, so we're involved in both poles. It costs, just in construction, to build a 5-story wood frame affordable housing project in San Francisco over $500,000 a unit. That's just hard construction costs, not land or other costs. That's not sustainable politically or otherwise. There's a lot of reasons for it. So modular can save cost. It can save a lot of time. Why hasn't there been more of it? Someone likened it to an inefficient industry, construction, like Airbnb and Uber, you know, I'll say attacked inefficient industries, except nobody's come up with the Airbnb or Uber. One of the issues has been scalability. Modular, like the initial solar industry, requires a production facility that is sustainable. If you're going to be relying on this, especially with the long lead times in California, are they going to be there 4 or 5 years from now? A friend of mine, a developer in the Bay Area, Rick Holiday, is quietly planning to literally build a facility in the East Bay in California. And to do that, to attract the investment, it's not that capital intensive. there needs to be a definable volume that you can count on, and you need strong enough partners so that people who might use it think, you know, they're going to be around for some time. And so here's the creative part. Maybe the Googles, the Facebooks, people like that who have huge housing issues for their base become investors in that. I think we got to get out of the box of, well, the construction industry will solve that. But I think there is potential. And so what is the resistance? Oh, it's modular, it's a shack. Same materials, same, you know, you can put whatever specs or finishes you want. It's using the same materials that conventional housing is using. We're also looking at it in the high-rise concrete. I'm going up to ULI in Seattle after this, and there's a very successful modular high-rise in Seattle. Again, this is Seattle, a place that's very sensitive to these things. So to address the cost issue, which is part of the equation in California, you asked earlier why it's different, really expensive. I think it's something that has a lot of merit. The only other thing I would say to your comment and Chris's about sort of local models, when you're just looking building by building, it's tough to move the needle. But there are examples, Playa Vista in LA, Mission Bay, and now the Trans Bay neighborhood where we're building in San Francisco, of, I'll call it redevelopment with a small r, where a master plan community in an urban area, not a suburban area, developed a mix of product, a lot of housing. There were some fights, especially in Playa Vista. In both Mission Bay and Trans Bay, at least 35% of the housing will be permanently affordable. That was part of the deal. Because when you're doing a rezoning, and the building industry always gets angry at me when I say this, you're doing a master community. You can't tell me it's impossible to set aside land for affordable housing. You're giving people entitlements that they didn't have, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, and you can point to those now, you can look, and they're not perfect. There are things that you would do differently, but they've had serving housing for a mix of incomes, creating a community in an urban setting that more or less fits in. So I think those two things warrant a lot further exploration.
But the one thing I'll throw in is, in addition to these very interesting concepts, why can't we look at Denver? Why can't we look at, you mentioned Philadelphia. Look at what's happened with the urban revitalization in Philadelphia over the last 10 or 15 years. Why can't we look at a variety of other urban areas? And Denver, I think, produced just about as much new housing units as Los Angeles did in the last 5 years. And there are other examples of success stories where we can model some of you know, what they've done. And the other thought process that we talk to our clients about quite often is the whole notion of home ownership. There still seems to be this, if you will, cultural focus on home ownership. And if you look at some of our counterparts around the world, for example, in Germany and Switzerland, the home ownership are between 40 to 50% versus our 63%. So it is culturally much more normal to have more of a renter base. And even though we are shifting toward that here in the US, and renting has become more of a consumer preference rather than just a reaction to the housing crisis and the crash that we had, it's still not quite as, if you will, as talked about or discussed or culturally accepted. But even within the rental community, if you look at what rent growth has done, even rents are becoming hard to afford.
Right.
You know, Class A apartment rents over the past 5 years have gone up on average $450 a unit nationwide. This is countrywide, U.S. Average. And that's a significant impact on affordability. So we're really kind of seeing it at both ends. And the last thought in terms of more immediate solutions is transportation. If it's so difficult to really improve the urban situation and so many obstacles, some of your concepts, I hope to God, will be pursued and we'll see some differences. But in the meantime, the suburbs are still there. They're just hard to get to from a transportation perspective. And you know, if there's some transportation solutions that can accommodate housing a little bit further out, I think that would be an important part of it. And Chris, you mentioned the question: Do we want to grow? And Gail, you brought it up as well. whether we want to or not, the growth is here. LA has added 450,000 jobs in the last 5 years. Companies want to grow. Companies want to add people. So that's not really a declaration of do we want to grow or not. It's happening as we speak. And so it's sort of it's play catch up while you run the race.
Well, it's an interesting discussion, though, when you go into communities.
Yeah.
Because while I think those of us in the industry understand the components of growth and how difficult they are to manage in any way, I think many communities sort of think, or neighbors and people who live there think that if you don't build it, they won't come. And we know that's not exactly true. I want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned about home ownership. Yesterday, I attended a fabulous panel on the American dream. And the American dream is described in many ways, but it almost always includes owning your own home. And part of the reason I think that's part of the American dream is because of what Chris mentioned, that it is a way that we've always thought of as accumulating wealth. But I'm sort of interested in that kind of wealth accumulation that you described really is a result of a dysfunctional market, isn't it? I mean, if we were producing housing at a rate that would accommodate the growth, if people had access to adequate housing, you would not be accumulating wealth in that way. How are we addressing this issue of housing, of ownership and rental? I know that you do both. And, but I'm interested because affordable housing we often think of as a place where we want to try to get people into home ownership. But if we look to the future, is that a good idea? Should we be encouraging people to own a home when maybe it makes more sense in terms of their flexibility and access to jobs?
Right.
Talk a little about that.
Yeah, Gail, I think the mindset that your house is going to be your retirement account is one that many of us in California kind of were born into, and we kind of go down that path. But the rest of the world, that's not what housing's about. Housing's about housing. So as I was thinking about today's panel, I thought, housing's just housing, housing's just shelter. We all know housing's a lot more than that. Housing's really the platform for education, for community health, for everything that grows out of having high quality housing. But it doesn't need to be home ownership. And I think as we can talk about what housing is, that will change over time and show different examples of how communities are successful with rental housing. One of the things that now being involved with the BIA and some of the legislation here in California talking about the mortgage interest deduction, right? Everybody just, I grew up here, I was born in Hollywood, grew up here, thinking mortgage interest deduction is cool and it's great and it's wonderful, but we need to really recognize what it is. It's a housing subsidy. So when you say to somebody, wow, that's a great housing subsidy you have, they are shocked, right? So just making sure that everything's kind of brought out onto the table. People are educated about different ways to live, and I think we will see a transition from the focus on home ownership and that rental is an acceptable form for flexibility, for job movement, for raising kids, especially if we can prioritize housing production, overall. We have done some home ownership projects that have been affordable, and I say it's just really difficult. In my mind, it's like it gets approved, it may get your development approved, but it's kind of glorified rental because there's some type of long-term affordable covenant on there that's going to eat up equity. And so it hasn't, I don't think it's financially made sense. I think it's just been one of those that gets a development approved in a community. And over time at Jamboree, we've really stopped doing those developments and really just doing more education on why the rental development that we're building is going to be a benefit, how it's going to increase values in that community for those existing residents, because we're going to be having people who are working that in the community live there, or people who are off the streets if we're doing permanent supportive housing come in and live there. And so it raises the value of all of the real estate in that community. So, you know,
Any-
No, I think the shift is already happening.
Yeah.
A lot of the rental demand today is coming from professional 30-somethings, empty nesters, and renters by choice, more so than any other recovery post-recession I think we've ever seen. And so a lot of what we're talking about is beginning to happen just driven by the consumer preference.
Yeah. So you think the consumer preference, the millennials, for example, who are going to change jobs more often, are looking for more flexibility.
Or even older renters. The 30-something professional that's occupying the high-end units that have been built in the last 3 or 4 years in a lot of urban cities around urban areas around the country, are just that renter by choice professional. They could afford a home, they could afford a condo, but they're choosing to rent for the very reason I think that you mentioned.
Any last thoughts from you, Chris? I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So while you're talking, I want all of you to be thinking of brilliant questions that we can challenge our panel with.
A lot of issues at play here. First of all, I would echo what others have said about Denver and Seattle as models that California, and particularly Southern California, can look to. I'm working on stories along those lines about both cities. Housing production, in particular in Seattle, Denver, it's more about the connection between housing and transit. And I think both those cities are ahead of where we are at this point. I think I'm glad that people have been mentioning policy, the adaptive reuse policy, the mortgage deduction. We have to think about some of this is demand and changing taste, and we'll see where the millennials turn out in terms of home ownership and where those trend lines go. But so much of this is driven by policy in ways that we don't talk about enough. And in terms of LA's own change in its civic identity after the war that I talked about in embracing the city of the freeway and the car, that was entirely driven by federal policy changes at the federal level. Cities that were growing, the federal government in the 50s was practically insisting that they build freeways and build houses, build cities around the single-family model. And also, I think we're beginning to have a very important and long overdue conversation about the ways that those policies built in inequality. And the wealth transfer that we're talking about was also deeply unequal in this city in terms of, let's say, the GI Bill or redlining covenants in this city and the ways that wealth was accumulated by white neighborhoods at the expense of the rest of the city. And we're beginning to think about, at least in my world, a connection between the architecture of the city, where experimentation and the kind of forward-looking character of the city was so wrapped up in the production of the single-family house that, I think we're beginning to see that that wasn't just an architectural story. That was a story about inequality. It was a story about race. It was a story about access and lack of equal access. And I think that has to be a broader part of the broader conversation about how we talk about the production of housing going forward and historically in the city.
Yeah, and I think that is happening in Los Angeles. Would any of you like to pose a question to our panel? Yes.
Could you talk about the impact?
Here, we're going to give a microphone to everyone who
Yes.
speaks.
Could you talk about the impact of the prevailing wage on the cost of housing?
Well, I think I will pose that to the folks here who are doing that building.
Well, I mean, I think you have to look at it in two ways. For those who advocate the prevailing wage, they're going to have to acknowledge that depending on the type of product and the market, that it adds anywhere from 15 to 30% of the cost of non-prevailing wage. You can say that's worth doing because people should be paid that. It's a policy call. It is more expensive. It just is. It's more extremely expensive the further away from the coast you get, because there is so little union activity in the Inland Empire or the Sacramento area that what is used as a prevailing wage is that much more expensive than conventional construction. You know, if there are public funds involved, generally there's going to be a prevailing wage requirement. It's a policy call. It is more expensive, and one can debate whether it's worth it, but it clearly is more expensive.
Well, I would echo what Bill said, I think that it's just the same as the mortgage interest deduction. We can make the decision that that's a value and that's a policy we want to have. I think it's the same with prevailing wage. We can clearly, at least related can, because they're doing market and affordable, so you have all types of examples. We do all affordable. We do some prevailing wage, some non-prevailing wage. We can show you the difference in the cost, but then it's a policy decision on, is that a value to the residents of that community or California or the nation, again, like the mortgage interest deduction value.
Other questions in the back? Please stand and tell us who you are.
Hi there, my name is Sean Robinson. I actually hosted that panel yesterday.
I was there.
On what happened to the American Dream. I just want to make a short comment. It's interesting what's happening in my hometown of Detroit in terms of housing. The city is getting an influx of people who are not from the state because the land bank there, just as recently as 3 years ago, had control of 90,000 abandoned homes and buildings. And people are coming to the city to find work, but actually being able to buy and own a home for $500. There are many people who have purchased homes there for $1,000, $5,000, homes that maybe 20 years ago would have been on the market for over $150,000. So it's a really interesting thing that's going on in cities. What they're trying to do in the city is identify those neighborhoods that are still sustainable and concentrate on getting people to buy those homes in those areas and renovate them and make those neighborhoods viable again.
Thanks, Sean. Over right here. Microphone.
Dick Ziman. Sense of urgency, I just don't see it. The mayor says 100,000 units. Here in Los Angeles, I think it's more like 300,000 or 400,000 units. First question. Secondly, where's the money going to come from to do it? I think we're sitting on a powder keg here in Los Angeles, and I'm sure elsewhere throughout the country, of what's going on with housing in the inner city. When is it going to happen? How are we going to make it happen?
And that's an affordable housing question.
Affordable.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Affordable.
Yes.
You're not going to solve the problem only by building new, because no matter how aggressive a city is, there's never going to be enough money, let alone dealing with the land use issues, as Laura mentioned earlier, to solve that problem. I think a couple of things. One, you have to preserve what's already affordable. We're involved in acquisition and rehabilitation of public housing, old public housing. And if anybody thinks that that isn't going down the tubes in terms of federal support, they're delusional. You can't lose what you already have. That's step one. Step two is neighborhood controls, so that you're seeing this in New York, San Francisco, parts of LA, so that gentrification, which is not always a bad thing, but it's managed in some way. And then thirdly, it goes to what I said earlier. It's either a priority of leadership or it isn't. I'll give you an example. Some years back, in one of an earlier effort by the city of San Diego to build a stadium for the Chargers, when redevelopment was still around, you had to set aside 20% of the tax increments from redevelopment for affordable housing. And they said, it was talking about affordable housing crisis. We said, well, why don't you set aside more tax increment for affordable housing? They said, because we have to save it for the stadium. Bad answer. It's not a priority. It's not a priority. So I think you need to see people stepping outside the comfort zone a little more. Maybe that will happen now. The bond measures are a positive sign, not enough. You need all of these things.
One thing I'll add to your question, the tax reform question mark is also out there, and it's affected the tax credit housing business significantly since the election outcome. If the corporate tax rate is reduced, the incentives to invest in tax credit units has become a big question mark. And we're hoping through various industry lobbying efforts that this is on the radar in terms of inclusion in tax reform, because if anything, it needs to make it more attractive for developers to invest more capital into affordable housing.
This is the last question. Let's go back here. Sorry.
Thanks. Josh Stevens. You've both alluded to the opposition you get both from homeowners, and Chris, you mentioned it, and also we know from grassroots groups in disadvantaged neighborhoods that are very, scared of development. It seems like needs to be some PR rehabilitation of the real estate industry. What can the industry do to win over those groups? How can it rehabilitate its image?
Way to go, Josh.
I'll
Okay,
jump in on that
guys,
because
come on.
We're seeing the generation of real estate graduates that are coming out of schools all over the country that are really into urban development, sustainable development, and very environmentally conscious. The talent that's coming out into the real estate industry today is unbelievable. And we're very privileged to have a lot of them as interns and entry-level analysts and so on for our company. And they're so interested in reinventing, to your point, the development process. That in and of itself, I think, is a very, very important first step because we're getting a lot more people involved. A lot of the next generation millennials are interested in real estate and urban planning. The second is the fact that goes back to the topic of alienating the developer and looking at the developer as the bad guy in all this. Mm-hmm. And I really do think there has to be a concerted effort, which I think ULI has done a fantastic job in addressing that. We have to break that barrier down because we need the developer, and we need the developer to succeed and be profitable and want to do the next project. So that's
yeah, I'm going to make the final comment as someone who's spent a lot of time in Los Angeles talking to communities. One of my observations is that for the most part, we're not aspirational here. We fear change because we think change will make it worse. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the industry to really have a sincere dialogue with folks about change that makes your life better. And not just about growth, but about how to improve the quality of life for people who live in Los Angeles right now. And we're doing wonderful things with our LA River. We're talking about capping freeways and reconnecting communities. There are a lot of wonderful things happening here. So I would challenge all of us to try to be a little more aspirational. Thank you all for coming, and please join with me in thanking our panel.